The soup sat on a chair where no one was sitting. That was the first thing Tanner Briscoe noticed when he stepped out of Barton Kells's general store with a sack of cornmeal under one arm and 2 small bags of salt in the other. A tin bowl, half full, left on the empty chair outside the trading post. The soup had already gone cold. A pale skin had formed over the top. Dust had gathered along the rim. No dog had touched it. No hand had claimed it. It just sat there in the shade. Beside a woman, the whole town of Dry Hollow Ridge was pretending not to see. Marian Rook sat on the bench near the chair, both hands folded over a small canvas bag in her lap. Her dress had once been green. Now it had faded into the color of dry sage. The cuffs were mended carefully, with thread a little darker than the cloth. Her boots were dusty at the toes. Her shoulders were straight, but not proud. More like a person holding herself together because falling apart would give people one more thing to discuss. It was the 43rd day without rain. Tanner knew because he had marked each day in the barn ledger at Briscoe Ranch. Right beside feed costs, cattle weight, and water hauled from the well. Numbers were easier than feelings. Numbers stayed where you put them. Grief did not. Papa. Tanner looked down. Jory had stopped beside him. 6 years old. Dark-haired. Gray-eyed. And too quiet for a child who should have been asking for candy. He was staring at Marian Rook. "Don't star," Tanner said under his breath. Jory did not look away. "Why is her soup on the chair?" "I don't know. Did somebody give it to her?" "Maybe." "Then why isn't she eating?" Tanner shifted the sack under his arm. Across the street, 2 women paused outside the church door and looked quickly away. A man near the saloon lowered his voice when he saw Tanner watching. Barton Kells stood in the store doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth, his face carefully blank. That was how Dry Hollow Ridge handled things it did not want to carry. It stepped around them. Marian looked at the bowl once, then back down at her hands. Jory stepped forward. Tanner caught his shoulder. "Jory." The boy turned, confused. "She looks like nobody has spoken to her all week." The words landed harder than any shout. Marian's head lifted. For one breath. Her eyes met Tanner's. Not pleading. Not accusing. Just tired. So tired it made him want to look away and angry at himself for wanting it. A few people had heard. Tanner felt the town tighten around them. A window curtain moved. Someone gave a small cough that sounded too much like judgment. "Sorry," Tanner said quickly, though he was not sure whether he was apologizing to Marian or to the town for letting his son say the quiet part out loud. Marian rose at once, brushing at her skirt, though there was nothing on it. "He did new arm," she said. Her voice was soft. Careful. The kind of voice that had learned not to take up space. Jory looked up at Tanner. "But it's true." "Enough." The word came out sharper than Tanner meant it to. Jory went still. That hurt worse. Tanner had not raised his voice much before Abigail died. Back then, the house had been full of her singing. Her questions. Her hands moving through flour, cloth, lamp smoke, and sunlight. She had known how to speak to Jory. How to answer the strange, honest things children noticed. Tanner only knew how to keep the ranch alive. He nodded once to Marian, stiff and useless, then guided Jory toward their horse. Behind them, the soup remained on the chair. Nobody touched it. They rode out of Dry Hollow Ridge in the white heat of afternoon. Jory sat quiet in front of him, small shoulders stiff, hands resting on the saddle horn. Tanner wanted to explain. Wanted to say that truth had weight in a town like that. That lonely women became gossip before they became neighbors. That men like him did not invite trouble unless trouble had already crossed the fence. But what came out was, You can't say everything you see. Jory stared ahead. Mama did. Tanner's chest tightened. Your mama knew when to speak. No. Jory said. Mama spoke when people needed someone to. Tanner had no answer. That night, after Jory slept, Tanner sat alone in the kitchen at Briscoe Ranch. Across from him was Abigail's chair, empty for 3 years. He had never moved it, never sat in it, never let anyone else sit there. He had told himself that was respect. But now, under the low lamplight, it looked less like respect and more like a place where life had stopped, and he had agreed not to disturb it. He thought of Marian Rook beside the trading post. He thought of cold soup on an empty chair. He thought of his son saying the truth in front of a town full of people old enough to know better. Then the dry wind moved under the door and made the lamp flame bend. Tanner looked toward Abigail's chair. For the first time in 3 years. He wondered if keeping grief quiet had taught his boy something worse than sorrow. It had taught him to walk past the lonely. 3 days later, Tanner Briscoe rode back into Dry Hollow Ridge for nails he did not truly need. He told himself the west gate had been hanging wrong. That was true. He told himself a man who owned cattle could never have too many nails. That was true enough. But the deeper truth sat beside him on the saddle in the shape of Jory, who had been quiet since the day of the soup bowl. The boy had not asked about Marian Rook again. That was worse than asking. Dry Hollow Ridge looked meaner in the morning heat. Dust clung to the store windows. The church bell hung still in its tower. Outside the saloon, 2 horses stood with Stryker's brand burned into the leather of their tack. Tanner noticed that first. Then he noticed Marian. She was walking past the saloon with her small canvas bag held tight at her side. Same faded green dress. Same careful steps. Her chin was lifted. But her eyes stayed forward in the way of someone trying to pass through a room without touching anything breakable. Doyle Hask leaned against one saloon post. Young, narrow-faced, and grinning like cruelty was a card trick. Well? Look there. Doyle called. Widow Rook still haunting the street. The man beside him laughed into his cup. Marian did not stop. Doyle pushed off the post and stepped just far enough to block her path. Where you headed? Mrs. Rook. Somebody finally hire you. Or you just walking around hoping pity turns into supper? Jory stiffened in front of Tanner. Papa. Tanner dismounted before he answered. His boots hit the dust hard enough to turn Doyle's head. Move aside, Tanner said. Doyle's grin widened, but his eyes flicked toward the general store. Barton Kells had come to the doorway. 2 women near the church had stopped pretending not to watch. Morning, Briscoe, Doyle said. Didn't know this was your business. It is now. Marian looked at Tanner once. Quick and frightened. Not because of Doyle. Because of what Tanner's help would cost. That look decided him. Tanner stepped between Doyle and Marian. But he did not raise a hand. He kept his voice low enough that Doyle had to listen and loud enough that the street could hear. A man who crowds a woman on a public road should be sure he wants witnesses. Barton Kells wiped both hands on his apron. I'm seeing fine from here. The second ranch hand shifted uneasily. Doyle's face tightened. You calling me trouble? I'm saying you should leave before you become some. For a moment, the street held its breath. Then the older ranch hand caught Doyle's sleeve. Come on. Stryker doesn't pay us to make scenes before noon. There it was. The name. Holden Stryker. Doyle spat into the dust. But he stepped back. Marian moved as if to leave. But Tanner turned toward her. Mrs. Rook. She stopped. Every window in Dry Hollow Ridge seemed to grow an ear. Tanner felt the weight of it. He felt Abigail's name waiting in every closed mouth. He felt Jory watching him, learning something from whatever he did next. I have work at Briscoe Ranch. Tanner said. Housework. Cooking, if you're willing. Bookkeeping, if you can learn it. $15 a month. Room and board included. Marian stared at him. Barton's hands stopped moving. Apart from the saloon porch. Doyle gave a soft laugh. Well, won't that make Sunday service interesting? Tanner did not look at him. Marian's fingers tightened on her bag. Mr. Briscoe. You should not offer something like that in the middle of the street. Yes. Tanner said. I should. Her face changed slightly. He continued. Clear and steady. You would have your own room. Your own door. A closed door stays closed in my house. My son will know the same rule. So will I. The street went quieter than before. Marian swallowed. Why? Tanner could have said because Jory saw you. Because I did too late. Because my wife would have done better than I did. Instead, he said, because I need help. And because work should go to someone willing to do it. Marian looked toward Jory. The boy gave her a small, serious nod. As if confirming that the offer was real. I will think on it. She said. That is fair. Tanner tipped his hat. Bought the nails he did not need. And left town before his courage could turn into regret. They were half a mile from Dry Hollow Ridge when Jory finally spoke. Is she coming home with us? She is coming to work. If she chooses. Jory leaned back against him. That's what lonely people say when they're afraid to ask for family. Tanner looked toward the dry road ahead. He had no answer. But this time, he did not tell his son to be quiet. Marian Rook came to Briscoe Ranch 5 days later. Walking beside a hired wagon with one canvas bag in her hand. Tanner saw her from the south fence line before Jory did. She stood at the edge of the yard, as if the dust itself had drawn a border. She was not sure she had permission to cross. Same faded green dress. Same careful posture. Same face that expected every door to close before she reached it. Jory saw her and ran. She came, he shouted. Tanner set down the hammer and walked toward the house. Wiping his hands on his trousers. He suddenly wished he had shaved. Or swept the porch. Or done anything that made the place look less like a man and a boy had been surviving in it instead of living. Marian turned when he approached. Mr. Briscoe. Tanner. He said. Out here. Mr. Briscoe sounds like somebody selling land he does not own. That almost made her smile. Almost. I thought about your offer. She said. If it still stands, I would like to accept. It stands. Jory came to her side. Breathless. I'm Jory. I have 21 rucks now. I found 4 more since town. One looks like it has stars inside. Marian looked down at him. And something in her face changed. Not much. Just enough to show there was still softness under all that caution. I would like to see it. She said. Jory's whole body brightened. Tanner picked up Marian's bag before asking. Then stopped himself and held it out again. Do you want to carry it yourself? She looked surprised. Then she nodded. Yes. For now. All right. He led her inside. The house embarrassed him the moment he saw it through her eyes. Dishes waited in the basin. Dust lay over the window ledge. A shirt of Jory's hung over a chair where it had been drying for 2 days. Abigail's old blue cup still sat on the shelf by the stove. Untouched. As if the whole room had been trained not to look at it. Marian saw everything. She said nothing. This way. Tanner said. The spare room was small. With a narrow bed. A plain dresser. One washstand. And a west-facing window. It had been used for storage after Abigail died. Tanner had cleared it the night before. Moving old tech. Broken tools. and 2 crates of things he had not been brave enough to sort. "It is yours," he said. Door closes. Nobody opens it without permission. Not me. Not Jory. Marian stood very still. A private room should not have looked like mercy. But on her face it did. "Thank you," she said quietly. Tanner nodded once. "Pay is $15 a month. Sundays free unless there is trouble with weather or stock. If you choose to leave, give me a week's notice. I will pay through the end of the month." She looked at him sharply. "You wrote that down." "Should I?" "Yes." So he did. He took the ledger from the kitchen shelf and wrote the terms while Marian watched. Work. Wages. Room. Board. Notice. Door respected. When he turned the ledger toward her, her fingers hovered over the page before she touched it. "I have not had terms written for me before," she said. Then it was overdue. Jory appeared in the doorway with both hands full of stones. "Can I show her now?" Marian looked at Tanner first, as if asking whether sitting on the floor in her work dress would be allowed. Tanner stepped aside. "She is off the clock until supper." Jory frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Marian said, lowering herself onto the dusty floor, "I have time to inspect important rocks." Jory sat across from her and began at once. "This one came from the creek bed. This one looked like a biscuit. This one was not pretty. But it was brave, because it had survived being stepped on by a horse." Marian listened to every word as if the stones were court evidence. Tanner stood near the stove and watched his son become loud again. Not noisy. Alive. That evening, Marian cooked beans with onion, corn cakes, and the last of the dried apples. It was simple food, but it made the kitchen smell like someone expected tomorrow to arrive. Jory ate 2 helpings. "Papa makes beans too salty," he said. Tanner closed his eyes. Marian looked down at her plate, but he saw the smile she tried to hide. For the first time in 3 years, laughter almost entered the room and did not turn back at the door. The next morning, Tanner rode into town for flour. Barton Kells leaned over the counter and kept his voice low. "People are talking." Tanner's hand tightened around the flour sack. "People talk when they have empty hours. This is different," Barton said. "Holden Stryker has been asking why a respectable widower brought Marian Rook under his roof." Tanner looked toward the street. Dry Hollow Ridge moved outside the window like nothing had changed. But something had. The house at Briscoe Ranch had begun to wake. And the town had noticed. Holden Stryker came to Briscoe Ranch on a windless afternoon. Tanner saw the dust first. 3 riders moved up the south road. Slow enough to show they were not in a hurry and close enough together to show they wanted to be counted. Tanner was mending a hinge on the barn door. He set the hammer down and wiped his hands on a rag. Marian stood by the clothesline with one of Jory's shirts in her hands. She saw Tanner's face and stopped pinning. "Trouble?" she asked. "Likely." Jory was inside at the kitchen table, practicing letters Marian had written for him on scrap paper. Tanner looked once toward the window, then stepped into the yard. Holden Stryker reined in near the well. He was a broad man in a clean coat, with silver at his temples and a smile that looked ready to become a knife if needed. The 2 men behind him stayed mounted. "Tanner Briscoe," Stryker said. "Been too long." "Not long enough." Stryker chuckled as if Tanner had made a friendly joke. His eyes slid to Marian. "Mrs. Rook." Marian did not answer. Stryker looked back at Tanner. "People are worried about you." "That's so. A widower alone with grief can make poor choices. No shame in it. We all respected Abigail." Tanner felt the name land hard between them. Stryker continued. "Soft and reasonable. But bringing an unattached woman into your home. letting her live under the same roof as your boy. Folks wonder what example that sets. Marian's hands tightened around the wet shirt. Tanner stepped slightly to the side, putting himself between her and Stryker's gaze. She works here. Of course. Stryker smiled. And I am sure you believe that is all people see. What people see is their business. No. Stryker said, his smile fading a little. A man's household is community business when it stains the name of a good woman who is no longer here to defend it. For a moment, Tanner heard only the wind dragging dust along the fence. Then Jory's small voice came from inside the open window. Papa. Tanner did not turn. Stay inside. Sown. Stryker's eyes sharpened. He had heard the boy. He had wanted to. This can be handled quietly. Stryker said. Send her away. No one will blame you. Barton might extend your credit again. Buyers may remember your cattle are worth looking at. Neighbors may find time to speak with you. So that was it. Not concern. Control. Tanner walked closer until only a few feet of dust separated them. You came to my land to tell me who may sit at my table. I came to warn you before pride costs you more than you can pay. Tanner's voice dropped. You speak about her with respect on my land. One of Stryker's men shifted in the saddle. Stryker's face hardened for the first time. You are making a lonely mistake. No. Tanner said. I made lonely mistakes for 3 years. This is different. The words surprised even him. Stryker studied him. Then gave a thin smile. Then keep her. And see what kindness costs when no one will trade with you. He turned his horse and rode out with his men behind him. The yard stayed quiet after they left. Too quiet. Marian lowered the shirt slowly. I should go. No. You heard him. He will make things worse. He was already making things worse for people long before you came here. But now he has a reason to hurt you. Tanner looked at her then. Really looked. He saw the fear under her calm. The guilt she had picked up from every room that treated her hunger like a crime. The way she was already preparing to leave before anyone could throw her out. Stop apologizing for needing a place to stand. He said. Marian blinked. Tanner took one breath. This ranch felt like a graveyard before you came. Her face changed. He looked toward the house, where Jory watched through the window with both hands pressed to the sill. My boy laughed at supper last night. Tanner said. He showed you rocks like they were treasure maps. He slept without waking. That matters more than Holden Stryker's opinion. Marian's eyes shone. But she did not look away. Before she could answer, a rider appeared on the north road. Young. Dusty. Urgent. Tanner moved toward the fence as the rider pulled up. You Tanner Briscoe. I am. Message from Ezekiel Hanley. Tomorrow night. Old Cormac Homestead. He says Stryker has been squeezing more than just you. The rider looked toward the empty road behind him. He says maybe it is time the small ranchers stopped standing alone. Then he wheeled his horse and rode off. Tanner stood with the message burning in the dry air. Behind him, Marian said quietly, What will you do? Tanner looked toward the road where Stryker had vanished. For the first time in years. He said, Not nothing. Old Cormac Homestead had been empty for 7 years. The house had fallen in on itself. But the barn still stood, leaning hard into the wind, like an old man refusing to kneel. Tanner reached it after sundown and found lanterns already burning inside. 12 men waited there. Some he knew by name. Others he only knew by fence lines. Cattle brands. And the careful nods small ranchers gave one another in town when pride kept them from saying they were barely holding on. Ezekiel Hanley stood beside a table made from 2 barrels and a plank door. A hand-drawn map lay open beneath one lantern. Glad you came, Hanley said. Tanner looked around the barn. Stryker knows about this. Not yet, Hanley said. But he will. One by one. The men spoke. Otis Vale had lost credit at Kells's store after refusing to sell Stryker his north pasture. Levi Marr's water access had been bought out from under him. Another rancher had been forced to pay fees on a cattle route his own father had used for 20 years. Tanner listened. And shame settled in his chest. He had thought his trouble began with Marian. It had only made him look up. Hanley tapped the map. Stryker wins because he meets us one at a time. We start moving as one. He loses half his power. Moving how? Tanner asked. Hanley's finger slid north across the map. Past the ridges. Past the marked waterholes. Toward a valley Tanner had heard about but never trusted. Lantern Creek. Hanley said. Water. Timber. High grass. Hard to reach. But outside Stryker's greep. A murmur moved through the barn. The pass is rough. Otis said. Yes. Families can't cross that easy. No. And if weather turns. Hanley looked at each man. Then we packed enough blankets, and chose our courage carefully. No one laughed. By the time Tanner rode home, the stars looked sharper than usual. He found Marian waiting on the porch. Shawl tight around her shoulders. How bad? She asked. Worse than I thought. He told her everything. The map. The water. The pass. The plan no sane man would choose unless staying had become slower ruin. Marian listened without interrupting. Inside the house, Jory slept with one hand wrapped around a stone he had found near the creek. At last, she said. What do you need me to do? Not should we run. Not is this my fault. What do you need me to do? Tanner looked at her. And for a moment, the dry yard. The empty fields. And the memory of Abigail's hands on every board of that house pressed against him so hard he could barely breathe. We leave in 3 days, he said. Marian nodded once. Then we pack for winter. The next 3 days vanished into work. Flour sealed in sacks. Blankets rolled tight. Medicines wrapped in cloth. Tools sorted by what could save a wheel. A roof. A wound. Or a life. Jory packed 22 rocks until Marian gently told him the wagon could not carry a mountain. On the last evening, Tanner stood before Abigail's chair. Marian came beside him but did not touch it. She built this house with me, he said. I know. Leaving feels like losing her again. Marian's voice stayed soft. Or carrying forward the part of her that knew when a house had done its work. The next morning, 13 families rolled north. Wagons creaked. Cattle moved in a restless line. Children sat between bundles of bedding and flour sacks, trying to look brave because their parents were trying harder. They had gone 5 miles when Jory pointed back. Papa. Riders. Dust rose behind them. Tanner rode to the rear with Hanley and Otis. Holden Stryker came out of the haze with 8 men at his back. You cross this land, Stryker called. You pay passage. Hanley's face hardened. This is open range. It is whatever I can hold. Tanner heard wagons stop behind him. Heard a baby cry. Heard Marian call Jory's name and pull him close. He looked at Stryker's men. Not Stryker. You all see the wagons. Tanner said. You see the children. Decide what kind of story you want told about you tomorrow. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one rider lowered his hand from his belt. Ribbon gauge. I did not hire on to frighten families, he said. Stryker turned on him. You ride for me. Reuben shook his head. Not today. 2 more men looked away. That was the first crack in Stryker's wall. Tanner kept his voice steady. We are leaving. You can let us pass. Or you can show every family here what your law is worth." Stryker's face darkened. But he moved his horse aside. The wagons started again. Marian looked back once. Then forward toward the mountains. Tanner did the same. Dry Hollow Ridge fell behind them. Lantern Creek waited ahead. Lantern Creek Valley did not welcome them gently. The first snow came 2 weeks after the wagons arrived. It fell thin at first, like ash from a cold fire. Then thickened until the valley disappeared behind white air. The creek kept moving beneath a skin of ice. The grass lay buried. The mountains closed behind them like a door. 13 families had reached safety. Now they had to survive it. There was no time for pride. Ezekiel Hanley said it first. Standing beside the half-built longhouse with snow in his beard and worry in his eyes. Private homes come later. Roof comes first. So they built one roof. Men cut timber. Women packed clay between the logs. Older children carried kindling, water, nails, and message. Younger ones sorted beans, folded blankets, and learned not to complain where everyone could hear. Marian Rook became useful in a way no one could ignore. She did not command loudly. She did not push herself forward. She simply saw what was missing and put it in order. A list of food stores by the stove. A corner for medicine. A board where children marked letters beside chores. A rule that no family ate alone unless illness required it. By the 3rd week, people stopped calling her Widow Rook. They called her Marian. Tanner noticed. So did Jory. One evening, after the wind had shouted itself tired against the longhouse walls, Jory sat beside Marian with his primer open on his knees. "I can read creek," he said proudly. "You can. And valley." "Yes." He looked toward Tanner. Then back at Marian. "Can I read your name next?" Marian's hand paused over the sewing in her lap. Tanner watched her face soften around the question. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." That winter changed Tanner in quiet ways. He still missed Abigail. Some mornings, grief rose before he did. But Marian never asked him to put it away. She made room for it beside the life still asking to be lived. On the last night of deep winter, Tanner found her outside the longhouse, standing beneath a sky bright with hard stars. "You'll freeze," he said, placing his coat around her shoulders. She looked at the valley. "I wanted to see it without everyone's breath on the windows." He stood beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Tanner said, "I loved Abigail. I know. I still do. I know that. Too." He turned toward her. "But I love you in the life that came after. If you can bear that kind of love." Marian's eyes shone in the starlight. "I can bear honest love," she said. "It's the hidden kind that ruins people." He took her hand then, slow enough for her to refuse. She did not. Spring came muddy and bright. They had just begun marking places for permanent cabins when Holden Stryker rode into Lantern Creek with 9 men behind him. This time, the valley did not scatter. Tanner, Hanley, Otis, Barton Kells, Reiben Gage, and the others stood before the longhouse. Behind them were women, children, tools, ledgers, flour sacks, and every proof that this place had become more than a hiding place. Stryker looked thinner than before, but meaner. "You built on land no one claimed," he called. Hanley stepped forward with a folded paper in his hand. "Then you admit it was unclaimed." Stryker's jaw tightened. Barton Kells lifted a small ledger. "I have records of every credit you pressured me to deny. Names, dates, orders carried through your men." Reuben Gage moved beside him. And I can name the men sent to frighten families off the road. Stryker looked back at his riders. For the first time, none of them looked certain. Tanner spoke past Stryker. To the men behind him. You see homes here. You see children. You see people who crossed winter and did not ask one rich man for permission to live. Decide whether you came here to keep order or to break what hungry people built with their own hands. One rider lowered his reins. Then another. Stryker's power did not fall all at once. It cracked like old ice. You cowards! He snapped. No one moved for him. That was when his rule ended. There was a brief, hard struggle when Stryker tried to force his way forward. But the valley held. No glory. No cheering. Just men choosing restraint over revenge. When it was done, Tanner did not let anyone drag Stryker through the dirt or make a show of him. He had him seated on a horse, guarded by Reuben and 2 witnesses. Hanley placed the claim paper inside Barton's ledger. These go to the territorial marshal. Hanley said, along with every name. Stryker stared at Tanner with cold hatred. Tanner only said, tell Dry Hollow Ridge the truth. Lantern Creek belongs to the people who kept it alive. The consequences did not come all at once. They came in small, solid pieces. 3 weeks later, word returned from Fort Laramont. The marshal had opened an inquiry into Stryker's water contracts, blocked cattle routes, and pressure on local credit. 2 buyers who had once feared him sent letters to Hanley instead. Barton Kells reopened trade with Lantern Creek first, then quietly moved his whole store north before summer. Dry Hollow Ridge did not burn. It emptied. Families who had whispered against Marian now watched wagon tracks leave their main street one by one. Not everyone apologized. Not everyone changed. But the town that had built its comfort on silence lost the one thing silence had protected: control. That afternoon, the whole valley gathered outside the longhouse. Not to celebrate Stryker's fall. To decide what kind of place would rise after him. Otis Vale nailed a new board beside the door. Lantern Creek Charter. Hanley read the first rule aloud. No person eats alone while a neighbor has bread. Barton read the second. No veto. Vedover. Child. Worker. Or stranger loses dignity because another person finds their need inconvenient. Then Tanner turned to Marian. This one should be yours. The third rule was written in her hand. Closed doors are respected. No one laughed. No one whispered. Marian stared at the words until her eyes filled. The valley had not merely allowed her to stay. It had taken the thing she once needed for survival and made it law for everyone. By summer, Lantern Creek had 23 homes, 1 trading post, and a schoolroom with a bell made from an old cooking pot. On the first morning of school, Jory stood before the slate board with chalk in his hand. He wrote slowly, Marian Rook Briscoe. Then he turned back to her. I can read your name now. Marian covered her mouth, but her eyes smiled. Tanner stood in the doorway and felt Abigail's memory beside him. Not as a shadow, but as a lamp passed from one hand to another. That evening, Jory placed his star-flecked stone beside the front step of the new Briscoe house. First stone, he said. For what? Tanner asked. Jory looked at Marian. Then, at the lamp burning in the window. For people finding their way home. Marian stood on the porch. Tanner stood beside her. Behind them, the lamp burned steady. Not for the dead. For the living who had finally stopped walking past the lonely. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.